So churches have been able to reopen since the 4th of July, but the government still has some significant restrictions in place still. So we just want to walk through what those guidelines are so we can consider our own response and feelings about coming back to public meetings. So the first thing is that you need to undertake, or we need to undertake, a risk assessment. We've got a small task force that will be responsible for that, and the Baptist Union has given us quite a comprehensive template to use. So when we think about coming back together, there are all kinds of things that we need to be making sure we've at least assessed from a risk perspective. So that will need to be done before we come back together, and that will of course impact our insurance, building insurance as well. There are no limits on the number of people who can attend a service. For weddings, that's capped at 30 attendees. But in terms of a church worship service, there are no limits on how many people can come together. However, you do need to adhere strictly to social distancing measures. So it's 2 meters unless that's impossible. And that would refer to probably areas like access to toilets. Maybe you've got a narrow corridor where it's not possible to keep the 2 meter distance. But the 1 meter plus is not an option if you just feel like going for 1 meters. You need to make sure that you've got the 2 meters wherever possible. If you went for 1 meter, you'd need to make sure that there were some other safeguards in place. For example, face coverings or partitions or something like that. There's no congregational singing and there's no soloists or music group. So that note there about not being essential to the act of worship, that's how the government sees it, that in terms of meeting together, you can still have a worship service. There's different ways of doing music, as we have been doing on Zoom. We've been using YouTube videos. So unfortunately, we couldn't have a live band here to do the music, or at least they could do the music, but they wouldn't be able to sing. So there's a big impact there in terms of congregational singing. Face masks, you'll have seen, are now mandatory, or they will be from the 24th of July in shops. There are other venues where they're not mandatory, and that would apply to churches. At the moment, there's no indication that you would need to wear a face mask if you came into the church building. But again, to come back to an earlier point, if it was not possible to distance at the 2 meters, then face masks or coverings would be one of the measures that you could take. Furthermore, the services need to be as short as possible, so you need to leave as soon as the service is finished, discouraged from socialising or having conversations in the building. So the idea is that you come in for the service and leave as soon as practically possible, so you would need to move on almost as soon as the service is finished. Baptism by immersion is discouraged. That may change now that swimming pools will reopen from the end of July. They may revise the guidelines on those, but there are other measures that would still need to be in place. So baptism by immersion would be problematic at the moment. In terms of communion, obviously at Wantage Baptist, we have individual cups, so that's not too much of a problem, but food hygiene measures need to be adhered to, and there's no speaking or praying over the elements, so we'd need to find a different way of doing that. Obviously over Zoom, we're all partaking individually from our homes, so the speaking over the bread and wine isn't a problem on Zoom, but if we were to do that publicly, we'd need to think about that. And in terms of things like hymn books or Bibles, ideally you'd bring your own, or books would be quarantined for 48 hours. Again, not so much of a problem because we'd only be using them once a week, so that isn't too much of an issue in terms of hymn books or Bibles. So places of worship are particularly vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19. So there have been outbreaks in churches. In terms of coming together for fellowship and those sorts of things, it's why there are strict guidelines around what we do when we come together as a church. There is a particular concern for those over 17, those shielding, and indeed those in that group have indicated, or many of them have indicated, that they would be quite hesitant about coming back together for public worship. So we need to keep that in mind. Track and trace would need to be in place, so that would involve details of people's names and phone numbers and things, so we can make sure that if anyone does come down with the virus, that we can notify those that have been in proximity to them. And finally, churches are expected to fully comply with these guidelines. So these are not options. They are things that we would need to make sure we adhere to. And part of that is for our public witness as well as anything else. So it's important that we do follow these guidelines, which are not unduly heavy-handed. And many, in fact, are quite pleased that the government has given more freedom than perhaps was expected in the way of worship services. So in terms of the way ahead, we really want to hear your feedback. Myself and the deacons will meet to discuss this on Tuesday evening. So we'll take the feedback that's already been received from the church meeting last Thursday. So please do let us know if you have any thoughts, concerns or ideas you'd like us to consider. Let's continue to pray for wisdom, as well as God's blessing on those who have been unable to join us on Zoom. But let's also remember the different ways we can remain in fellowship and encourage one another while we're unable to meet in the way that we're used to.